Hey, Chris Taylor from Actionable coming at you today to address the number one question that we are asked by consulting firm owners. That question being, how do I prove the impact of my training programs? How do you do it? You're designing these brilliant programs that are going to have participants going through periods of transformation. It's going to advance the strategic priorities of your client organizations, and yet so often we are reliant on smile sheets, on evaluation forms to basically determine whether the program we delivered has value to the organization or not. I'm going to suggest that there's a better way, a more structured way. We're going to work through 3 key elements that you may want to think about when you are designing and positioning your training programs to your prospective clients. Without any further ado, let's jump into it. Step number 1, we need to find our anchor KPI. What do I mean by this and why? Well, when we're looking at attempting to prove the impact of our training program, we need to know what we're anchored to. What's the outcome that we're trying to create? Now, there's a series of questions that you can walk through pretty comfortably and quickly with any prospective client to identify whether they have clarity on what their desired business impact is and how aligned your solution is to that. So here's the 4 questions that I recommend walking through with your client or prospective client. Number 1, let's assume, this is what you say to the client. Number 1, let's assume that this program is a wild success and all of your people going through the program are coming out the other side changed. How are they acting differently as a result of this program? How are they interacting differently? How are they showing up differently in their work? This is a question that most people, if given a moment, can answer. They can think about, I invest in this leadership program and people go through it and they come out the other side and they are showing up on time. They're having, courageous conversations. They are, holding people to account, etc. It's going to vary based on client, but your space, your industry, you're likely going to have a reasonably short list of consistent answers that pop up. But this is question number 1, is get them to visualize what's on the other side of a successful deployment of this program and have them list out some of those characteristics. Now, when you do this, they'll be thinking mostly around the people, right? Around the behavioral changes, although they may not call it that their participants are going to go through. So question number 2 is around anchoring those individual behavior changes to the business itself. And so you're, in agreement with them. Yep, sounds great. Absolutely. That all makes sense. So tell me when people are, and then you sort of paraphrase back to them some of the key points you heard. When people are showing up on time, when they're holding people to account, when they're entering courageous conversations, how will that impact the business? And then just let them talk. They may need a minute to process, but they'll start to think about it. Be like, well, I guess there'd be less friction and we'll have better on-time delivery of projects and less communication breakdown and what have you. You're going from the individual that's going through the program to the business impact of those individual behavior changes. Yeah. So we're getting to a place of starting for them to identify what things look like internally from a business impact standpoint, which then leads to the 3rd question. Cool. So what I heard in there was less breakdowns in communication and faster on-time delivery. And they go, yeah. Saying, great. So I'm just curious, do you have KPIs around that? Do you have any way of measuring those things right now? And they'll answer yes or no, right? If they do, great. We're going to start to anchor to those. If they don't, ask for a proxy. Don't ask for a proxy, but start to dig to identify a proxy, right? Basically to say, okay, so you don't have anything around breakdowns in communication internally. That's fine. How else might in your data, in your sort of employee health data, would you see breakdowns in communication manifesting? Where else are they going to show up? It might be in employee engagement surveys. It might be in 360 reviews. It might be in performance reviews. It might be somewhere else. It's a little bit squishier, but still something that they're doing already that should be impacted by a successful deployment of program. This is the goal. We're not trying to create extra work for them. We're trying to do the detective work of identifying where internally they're already measuring things that we can anchor to, that our programs are going to be aligned in moving the needle on. So we get to question 3, and there's a little bit extra work here. They may even need to go away and do some research. As you get to know your industry, you'll likely identify some hooks that they already have, some existing KPIs that you can anchor to. But this 4th question is so critical in ensuring that your programs get the attention that they deserve. And this 4th question is, how does improving those metrics align to the organization's stated priority for the year? I'll repeat that. How does improving these metrics align to the stated priorities of the organization for the year. We have all been on the receiving end of budget cuts. We've all had programs pushed down the line because it just wasn't deemed to be the most essential investment for the organization. You can save yourself a lot of headache and a lot of extra work by identifying early on if there is alignment and to what degree your program, and specifically the impact on KPIs that your program will drive on the strategic priorities of the organization. This is a critical question. It enables you to cut right through the noise to a place of, we're going to move the needle on some internal KPIs. Are those KPIs the important ones for the organization this year? Step number 2, improving the impact of my training programs, moving into design for impact, not for content. Design for impact, not for content. What are we talking about here? What we're really discussing is the alignment of making sure that your content, that's what you're putting into the program, is only the content that moves the needle on the behaviors that are going to directly impact the KPIs that matter most to the organization. This is about alignment and streamlining. I get it. As a content creator, we have our darlings, right? Those pieces of content that we know kill in the room, that we feel very confident in, that we see light bulbs going off for folks in the room. That's great. And are the light bulbs that are going off in alignment with the metrics that we're trying to move the needle on? I've seen too many times training sessions become bloated with content simply because we haven't done the work of identifying what the path of least resistance is to achieving the business outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So how do we do this? Well, number 1, I've got a separate video on this around how do we make learning stick, which if you're curious about this, you can do a deeper dive into this. I want to hit some of the high levels here right now. The first thing that I want to hit on is we want to focus on habits, not tasks. Habits, not tasks. Again, if the purpose of each training session is to drive the behavior changes that will move the needle on the KPIs that matter most, then we want to make sure that we're focused on giving people the inspiration and the motivation to want to change the behaviors and to know how to do it. So we want to focus on habits, not on tasks. What do I mean by that? In the actual sessions themselves, right? Are you equipping participants with real clarity around the daily practice that they can execute on to realize your content, to establish new norms, right? New behaviors that over time will lead to behavioral change that will lead to improvement on the KPIs that matter most to the client. So encourage you to focus on habits, not tasks. Michael Bungay-Stanier wrote a great book called The Coaching Habit. The reason I reference it is that in it, he uses a formula that he calls the new habit formula. It says basically this: when this happens, instead of doing this thing, I will do this thing because, and the reason why it matters. That sounds familiar. You may have read a book with the word habits in the title in the last 15 years. Charles Duhigg writes about this. BJ Fogg did a ton of research around this. Basically, we want to be thinking about how we can equip our participants with a behavior, with a habit forming mindset. Organizing your content into sound bites that turns it into, when this happens, instead of this, I will this because, does a huge positive step for them in actually turning the content into something that they can practice on a daily basis. So that's number 1. Second, because we're focused on behavior change in our session now, we want to focus on priming our group for that. A lot of people have been in a lot of training where behavior change was not the point. Content consumption was the point, even if it wasn't explicitly stated. So because your sessions are going to be a little bit different, you want to prime your group for that. One of the consultants we work with in the UK came up with this line years ago that I love. In the first 2 minutes of his time in the room with the participants, he'll say, hey, we're going to cover a lot of great stuff. You're going to learn a lot. You're going to have fun. You're going to make new connections. None of it's going to matter if we don't put some of these ideas into practice following the session. So at the end of the session, I'm going to be challenging you to identify the number 1 thing that resonated with you, the concept that hit you sort of closest to the heart, where you say, that matters to me. And I'm going to be equipping you with tools to make sure that that change happens following the session. Sound good? The group goes, yeah, great. So that's priming. You can then also prime them at the midway point in the session. This is true if it's a 90-minute session or a 2-day session, basically to get them to review their notes. This is, sort of halfway through the session saying, hey, remember at the beginning, I said that at the end, I was going to challenge you to identify your one biggest takeaway and restructure it into a daily practice because we want to level up through this program. They go, yeah, I remember that. Saying, great, let's imagine that the session ended now. Look back through your notes and identify the biggest takeaway, the thing that mattered most to you. And then we're going to restructure it into a when instead of I will statement so that they actually have some practice at crafting commitments and understanding what a daily practice looks like for them. So that by the end of the session, if you allow 15-ish minutes at the end of the session, you can do the same thing, saying, hey, now we've covered all the content we're going to cover. I want you to review your notes. I want you to pick the one thing that mattered most from this session. I want you to structure it through a when instead of I will because structure so that they have a very tangible takeaway leaving the session. But that's not enough. It's a good place to go, but now we want to create some motivations. We want to tap into both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Let's talk about extrinsic first. One of the fastest and easiest ways you can create sort of pressure from the outside is to normalize the behavior change habit. How do you do that? You ask them to make public declarations. You say, as a group, what are we committed to changing leaving the room? As a group, how often are we committed to reflecting on our progress? As a group, are we willing and comfortable to share with one another our progress, where we have wins and where we fall down? You get them talking about it in the room. This is the most inspired they will ever be around your content, is towards the end of the session when their ideas are fresh, their motivation is high, they have good intention towards change. I've been doing this 16 years. I've seen literally tens of thousands of sessions. I've seen hundreds of thousands, millions of participants. It is extremely rare that people get to the end and go, no, I don't care. We're like 98% of the time, people are motivated. They want to do better. They want to be better. We want to bottle that. We want to reinforce that in the weeks following the session. So you do that by getting some social norming going on. And then that's extrinsic. You also want to get some intrinsic motivation going. This is the motivation that comes from within. So how do you do that? I go through an exercise of helping them find a deeper why. A deeper why looks like this. They crafted a commitment to daily practice. They said, when I'm in a meeting, instead of leading with my opinion, I will ask for the input of one quiet colleague. Something like that. Because I want to be seen as a more empathetic leader. Might have been the thing that they said. Okay, good. Good, but not great. The why and connecting to a deep why is what's going to hold them through the challenges, the inevitable challenges of establishing new behaviors, of creating new habits. Change is hard. We need as many tools and legs up as we can in realizing lasting change. So I guide them through a series of 4 questions that can be done in about 3 minutes that gets them to a place of deep resonance, a deep personal why. Here's the 4 questions. Number 1, why? We covered that. It's the because question, right? They give you an answer. It's going to have some level of depth. Usually it's reasonably superficial, and it's usually quite cerebral. It's a head thing. Next question, who? Okay, so they've said why. Because I want to show up as a more empathetic leader. Who do you think will be impacted when you realize this change, when you become a more empathetic leader? Who? Names, right? Not bodies of people, but names. List them out. Who? They'll make a list of some people. Then how? How do you think you becoming a more empathetic leader is going to impact those people? And let them think. Let them take notes. All of this should be written out, right? There's power in written word. So let them write it out. They're going to write it out. Then the 4th question, how will that make you feel? Knowing that you've created that change for them. How will that make you feel? What we've done here is we've gone from a cerebral understanding of the why. Here's a reason why, right? In sort of business language. Who's impacted by that? Oh, now it becomes a little more real. These are people. I can picture their faces, their reactions, their I'm just gonna say essence, the way they are when I'm around them. How will this impact them? Now we're fast forwarding in time. We're imagining the change that we've created in ourselves and the impact that that's having on other people. For most human beings, this hits us hardest. We are less likely to disappoint other people than we are to disappoint ourselves. When we start to think about the impact that our efforts will have on those around us, we become more ingrained to it. And then we want to lock that in by explicitly asking the question, how will that make you feel when those people are changed? I've yet to see an exercise that can be done as efficiently in driving as great a resonant change around for the individual. Where come hell or high water, they're going to make this change happen. So that's how we get into a deeper why. That's how we tap into intrinsic motivation. And then the last thing, and this is very tactical, moving way back out into the headspace, you want to allocate resources to the sustainment effort. This may sound obvious, but far too often we focus on all the things that are happening in the room, what lunch is going to cost, or what that, sort of VR experience is going to cost, whatever the thing is. It's all about investing heavily in the experience itself, which is great if the focus is the experience. But if your focus is impact, which I would suggest it is when your client is asking, how do you prove the impact of this program? You want to make sure that you're allocating some of your resources, both dollars and time, to what happens after and between sessions. If you go into this eyes wide open and think about the fact that it doesn't be a lot, 10% of your overall budget put into sustainment, you are going to automatically, sort of increase the likelihood that change is going to happen because you're putting resources there. So there's lots in there I appreciate, but that's really the tip of the iceberg around how we can design our programs for impact. Hopefully you took a couple of great pieces out of that. All right, point 3, improving the impact of your training programs comes down to measuring change, measuring specifically behavior change. Why behavior change? Well, because behavior change starts to happen immediately. The individual's efforts towards that behavior change may start literally when they leave the room, the very next day. And if we can shine a light on that, if we can start to create some visibility and measurement around that behavior change, then we can start to connect the dots between behaviors that shift and the ultimate impact that it has on the KPIs that we identified earlier in the process. Give an example of this. There was a client we were working with, a health and safety client. They were doing a leadership program, but around health and safety. And it was a big program, a couple hundred sort of leaders going through this. And their key metric was around injury stop time. They wanted it to come down. There's a very real dollar cost, obviously, to injury stop time, plus, dismemberment, bad. So that was the focus. The behavior changes that they were working on were things that were, stop and scan when you enter a job site. Things that are very practical, very real for the individuals. But what we were able to do was to say, yeah, there's some behavioral changes happening at this site and this site and this site for this team and this team and this team that then correlated to a reduction in injury stop time, in the extreme cases of over 300% reduction in injury stop time, that we could sort of track back in time. And we could say these behavioral changes led to these improvements in injury stop time. Whether it's correlation or causation kind of doesn't matter at that point. We know that people went through a training, they shifted some behaviors, and at the same site, injury time went down. Most buyers, that buyer, went, we want more of that, please. And so then they double down, they triple down, they start to invest heavily in this because we actually start to put an ROI to this. There's an actual dollar return on the training program that we're driving. Just like any other function, it's the responsibility of senior leadership to ensure that the dollar bets that they are making are good bets, that they are investments that have a higher return than the money they put into it. I know that sounds incredibly obvious. And yet in this industry, this space that we all occupy, far too often it's because it's the right thing to do or because people have been asking for it. Those are great, noble reasons, but they're hard to justify in times of recession, in times of uncertainty, when cash is tight and when isn't it. We want to make sure that we are able to show that there is a positive dollar return on the trainings that are being driven. So behavior change. And how do we actually do that? Self-reporting, which I know sounds crazy because self-reporting can be wrong. Sure it can. But what we have found in literally hundreds of thousands of examples now of participants choosing to make commitments to behavior change at the end of a session and then logging their own progress on that behavior change is that most people don't lie. Most people want to realize change. They want to do good. It's something that mattered to them based on us taking them through the path of getting to a place where it matters to them. So that when they are reporting, it's a place of genuine sense of progress. And on an individual basis, it doesn't really matter if they rate themselves a 6 out of 10 today or an 8 out of 10 today. The point is we want to look at where our groups, cohorts within our population trending up and on which behaviors, so that we can look then later in time and say, there was a positive impact in injury stop time. There was a positive impact in employee retention, in absenteeism reduction, in whatever the metric is that matters to your client based on the program you're running. When we can see that correlation, we can say these behaviors are correlated to this improvement and it was all driven by this training, that's a bet we want to keep making. We can go deeper on this, obviously. And if you want to figure out how you can do this for your own practice, I'd encourage you to reach out, actionable.co. We'd be happy to take some time, understand the nature of your program, and start to show you how you can prove the impact of your programming to your clients, really, this month. So feel free to reach out. In the meantime, I do hope you found this useful. I just want to reiterate the fact that proving the impact of your training program starts from a place of identifying, are you even designing this to drive impact in the first place? Are you then working with the client to understand which metrics matter most and what we're trying to move the needle on? And then can you measure behavior change as a vehicle to move the needle towards the desired impact? Until next time, I'm Chris Taylor at Actionable. Be well.